A pregnant woman falls to the ground after a brutal punch from a racist cop. But what happens next flips the entire story on its head. Justice, betrayal, and a twist no one expected. Stay till the end, because this is far from over. The streetlights flickered faintly over the quiet neighborhood as Latasha James stood outside the small convenience store, clutching a plastic bag filled with milk and bread. The cool night breeze brushed against her skin, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, resting a hand on her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant, and exhaustion clung to her every movement. The store owner had just locked up for the night, offering her a friendly nod as he flipped the sign to closed. Latasha smiled politely, waiting patiently on the curb for her husband Marcus to arrive. He was running a few minutes late from his shift at the warehouse, but she didn't mind. These days, a few minutes of quiet felt like a gift. As she checked her phone for any messages, the low rumble of a police cruiser disrupted the silence. The patrol car slowed as it approached, and Latasha instinctively stepped back, her heart quickening. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just waiting. But she'd grown up learning that not doing anything wrong didn't always matter. The cruiser came to a stop right in front of her. The driver's side door swung open, and Officer Rick Thompson stepped out. He was a large man, his shoulders broad beneath the dark blue uniform, and his expression sharp with suspicion. "You got business being out here?" Thompson's voice was curt, cutting through the stillness of the night. Latasha blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the hostility in his tone. "I'm just waiting for my husband. He'll be here any minute," she answered softly, keeping her voice even, careful not to escalate the situation. Thompson's eyes narrowed, scanning her from head to toe as if her very existence was an inconvenience. "Loitering, huh? You sure you're not up to something?" "No, sir," Latasha replied, clutching her bag tighter. "I just came from the store. I live right down the street." "Got ID on you?" Thompson demanded, his hand resting on the edge of his belt. Latasha hesitated. "I didn't bring my wallet. I only came to pick up a few things." Thompson scoffed, taking a step closer. "Convenient." Latasha felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She shifted slightly, careful to keep her posture non-threatening. "I'm not causing any trouble. I just want to get home." The officer's gaze remained hard, his lips curling into a sneer. "You people are always causing trouble." Before Latasha could process the insult, Thompson leaned closer, his presence suffocating. "I don't know who you think you are, but you'd better not be lying to me." "I'm not," Latasha started to explain, but Thompson was already moving. In a flash, his hand shot forward, delivering a sudden violent punch to her abdomen. The impact sent Latasha staggering backward, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. Pain exploded through her body as she stumbled to the ground, gasping for breath. She crumpled onto the cold pavement, clutching her belly in disbelief. The world around her blurred, her mind racing, heart pounding. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaky, but Thompson offered no answer. He stood over her, his shadow looming in the glow of the streetlight, as if waiting for her to react, waiting for an excuse to escalate further. Latasha's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, hoping to call Marcus, but the searing pain in her abdomen made it nearly impossible to focus. The baby. She could feel the baby shifting, reacting to the trauma, and the fear that something might be wrong swallowed her whole. A couple walking their dog across the street saw the incident unfold, freezing in shock. "Call someone," the woman whispered urgently to her partner. "She's pregnant." The man fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling, knowing what they had just witnessed wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Latasha lay on the cold pavement, pain radiating from her abdomen as her mind swirled in confusion. Every instinct screamed at her to get up, to do something, but the sharp ache forced her still. She drew a shaky breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "Please let the baby be okay," she thought, cradling her stomach as if that alone would shield her child from the violence. Officer Thompson loomed above her, his expression unchanged, cold, indifferent. as if what he had just done was routine. He gave a slow, deliberate glance around the street, checking if anyone else was watching. Seeing the couple across the road, now hurriedly making a call, seemed to harden his stance. "You better stay down," Thompson muttered, his voice low but laced with a veiled threat. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Latasha winced, biting down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. She knew the situation was precarious. Any resistance, any word out of place could provoke him further. And in her condition, she couldn't afford to risk that. Her baby's life depended on her staying calm. But before she could speak, the officer stepped closer, towering over her like a judge passing down a verdict. "I asked you a question, didn't I?" he snapped. "I didn't do anything," Latasha whispered, her voice trembling, struggling to piece together words between waves of pain. Thompson scoffed. "You people always got excuses. Makes my job harder." Just as he leaned down toward her again, headlights swept across the street, bright and sudden. Latasha squinted against the glare, her heart catching in her throat. A second later, she heard the familiar rumble of her husband Marcus's old car pulling to the curb. The car door flung open before the engine even finished turning off. Marcus James, still wearing his work uniform from the late shift, bolted from the driver's seat, panic etched into his face. "Latasha!" he shouted, sprinting toward her. "Stay where you are," Thompson barked, one hand now resting dangerously close to the grip of his sidearm. "Back off!" Marcus froze in place, breathing hard, his eyes darting between the officer and his wife, who was struggling to push herself up from the ground. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus demanded, fear and fury mixing in his voice. "She resisted," Thompson said flatly, as if that explained everything. "Resisted what?" Marcus yelled, taking a cautious step closer despite Thompson's warning. "She's pregnant. You put your hands on her?" "Back off." Thompson's hand shifted even closer to his gun, his eyes narrowing in warning. The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus clenched his fists, visibly struggling to keep his emotions in check. Latasha saw the fear in Marcus's eyes, and she knew exactly what he was thinking. Any sudden move from him, and this officer wouldn't hesitate to draw his weapon. Her heart clenched at the thought. She couldn't let things escalate further. "Marcus," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. "Please don't." Hearing her voice calmed him, if only slightly. Marcus raised his hands slowly, taking a step back, though his gaze never left Thompson. "Look, man," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "She needs a doctor. Let me take her to the hospital. She's not a threat to you." Thompson sneered, as if the very idea of backing down offended him. "She stays right here until I say otherwise. Got that?" Marcus's jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. He knew better than to push further, knew exactly how these situations could go. The statistics were always in the back of his mind, the stories that ended in tragedy. And here he was, standing at the edge of one of those stories, praying it didn't end the same way. "Please," Latasha whispered again, clutching her stomach tighter, trying to will the pain to stop. "The baby. I think something's wrong." A flicker of uncertainty passed over Marcus's face, his fear growing by the second. He knew every moment they stayed here, every second wasted, could cost them their child. But Officer Thompson showed no sign of relenting. More cars slowed as they passed, rubbernecking at the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. The couple from across the street was still on the phone, gesturing anxiously toward the commotion. "We've got an ambulance coming," the woman called out to Marcus. "Hang in there." Latasha squeezed her eyes shut as another wave of pain tore through her. She could hear Marcus muttering under his breath, a helpless prayer that the paramedics would get there in time. And in that moment, as she lay helpless on the concrete, Latasha realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about survival. Not just her own, but her unborn child's. And there was no telling how far Thompson would go to maintain control over this situation. As she tried to steady her breathing, Officer Thompson took a step back, casting a glance toward his patrol car. He pulled his radio to his mouth. "Unit 412 requesting backup," he said calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Got a situation here." Latasha's stomach sank. She knew that things were about to get a lot worse. The street seemed to grow quieter, the oppressive weight of tension filling the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Latasha lay still on the cold pavement, every breath a shallow, painful gasp. Marcus crouched beside her now, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. His other hand hovered near her swollen belly, desperate to offer comfort, but helpless against the pain she was enduring. "You're gonna be okay," Marcus whispered, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. "The ambulance is on the way, just hold on." Officer Thompson stood a few feet away, his posture rigid, as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. He tapped his fingers against the radio clipped to his shoulder, impatience clear in every movement. Despite the gravity of the situation, he seemed unbothered, as if striking a pregnant woman was no more than an annoyance to his night shift. The low hum of an engine soon grew louder, and another patrol car appeared, pulling to a sharp stop beside Thompson's cruiser. Two officers stepped out, both white men in identical uniforms, their faces blank with professionalism. "Thompson, what's the situation?" asked the older of the two, his gaze flickering briefly toward Latasha on the ground. His tone wasn't concerned, merely procedural. "Got some resistance," Thompson replied curtly. He gestured toward Latasha with a dismissive tilt of his chin. She wouldn't cooperate, things escalated. The new officers exchanged a glance, as if silently deciding whether or not to question Thompson's story. Neither seemed particularly interested in challenging him. "She's pregnant," Marcus interjected, his voice trembling with rage he struggled to keep under control. This piece of trash hit her. We need to get her to the hospital now." The younger officer, shifting uncomfortably, looked at Marcus. "An ambulance is already on the way, sir. You just need to stay calm." "Calm," Marcus barked, disbelief dripping from his words. "He punched my pregnant wife in the stomach, and you're telling me to stay calm?" Latasha squeezed Marcus's hand weakly, urging him to stop before things spiraled further. "Please, baby," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "Don't. It'll only make it worse." But Marcus's fists remained clenched at his sides, the veins in his arms bulging with restrained fury. He stared down Thompson, his body vibrating with the tension of holding back everything he wanted to say, everything he wanted to do. Thompson smirked slightly, just enough to let Marcus know he enjoyed this. The power imbalance was intoxicating. A black man, furious, but forced to stand down, powerless against the system that protected Thompson's every move. Just then the faint wail of sirens echoed from down the street. The ambulance was approaching, but it felt agonizingly slow. Every second dragged, each one heavier than the last. The older officer turned toward Thompson, lowering his voice. "Look, let's just handle this smoothly. Last thing we need is this going viral." "It already is," the woman from across the street called out, holding her phone high. "Everything's on camera. Y'all better pray she's okay." The officers turned toward her, their faces hardening at the realization that the incident wasn't contained. Thompson's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. The power he thought he held was beginning to slip, and it was clear he didn't like it. "Mind your own business," Thompson barked at the couple, but the damage was already done. "People are gonna see this," the woman continued undeterred, "and they're not gonna forget it." Marcus allowed himself a small, grim smile, just enough to let Thompson know that the world was indeed watching, whether he liked it or not. The control Thompson thought he had was crumbling, and they all knew it. The ambulance finally screeched to a halt at the curb, and two paramedics jumped out, rushing toward Latasha with their equipment in hand. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" one of them asked gently, kneeling beside her and assessing her condition. "She's in pain," Marcus answered urgently. She's pregnant. He hit her in the stomach." Marcus's voice cracked as the words spilled out. Saying it aloud made the horror of it feel even more real. The paramedic's expression darkened, though he remained focused on his task. "We need to get her on the stretcher. Can you move, ma'am?" Latasha nodded faintly, though her body screamed with every small shift. The paramedics carefully lifted her onto the stretcher, securing her in place as Marcus hovered anxiously beside them. "Where are you taking her?" Thompson demanded, stepping forward as if he still had any authority over the situation. The paramedic shot him a cold, professional glance. "To the hospital where she needs to be." "You need to wait for me to finish questioning." "No, I don't," the paramedic snapped, the first sign of defiance anyone had dared to show Thompson. "She's in pain and this is an emergency. Now step back." The crowd of bystanders murmured approvingly, emboldened by the paramedic's words. A few more phones were raised, capturing every second of the confrontation. Marcus followed closely as the paramedics loaded Latasha into the ambulance, his hand never leaving hers. "I'll be right here, baby," he whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I've got you." As the ambulance door swung shut, Officer Thompson stood frozen on the sidewalk, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in. He could feel the eyes of the crowd bearing down on him, feel the silent condemnation in every glance. Every camera pointed his way. And for the first time, Thompson's smug confidence wavered. Inside the ambulance, the hum of the engine vibrated beneath Latasha as the paramedics worked quickly, checking her vitals. One paramedic adjusted the oxygen mask over her nose and mouth, speaking in soothing tones as they assessed her condition. "Stay with me, Latasha," the paramedic urged. "We're almost there. How's the pain? Can you still feel the baby moving?" Latasha gave a faint nod, but fear gripped her heart. The baby's movements had become sluggish, not as sharp and frequent as they were earlier. Every second that passed filled her with dread. What if something was wrong? What if they were too late? Marcus sat beside her on the narrow bench, his hands clasping hers tightly, as if holding her would anchor them both. His knuckles were white from how hard he gripped, and the tension radiating from him was almost tangible. "I'm right here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're not alone. I'm not going anywhere." Latasha gave his hand a weak squeeze in response, but her mind raced. She could still see Officer Thompson's cold expression in her mind, the smug look of someone who thought he'd never face consequences. The pain in her abdomen throbbed with each breath, and she couldn't help but wonder, would this have happened if she were someone else? Someone Thompson thought mattered? Marcus leaned closer, brushing her hair back from her damp forehead. "The baby's strong," he whispered, as much to reassure himself as her. "You're strong. Just hang on a little longer, okay?" Latasha tried to smile, but the fear clung too tightly. She had heard too many stories. Innocent people caught in the crossfire of authority unchecked. Lives derailed by moments like this. And now it wasn't just her life hanging in the balance. It was their child's too. The paramedic's voice broke through her thoughts. "Her blood pressure's high. We need to move fast when we get there." He pressed his radio to his mouth, relaying the situation to the hospital, while his partner monitored the fetal heart rate. "Can you hear it?" Marcus asked, panic simmering beneath his voice as he strained to hear the rapid thumps on the monitor. "Faint, but it's there," the paramedic answered. "We're going to stabilize her." Marcus exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for a moment as if willing the nightmare to stop. Latasha could feel the warmth of his hand in hers, steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. It was the only thing keeping her grounded, the only thing holding her together. "Marcus," Latasha whispered through the oxygen mask. "I'm here, baby," he whispered back, leaning in close. "What is it?" Her eyes brimmed with tears, spilling onto her cheeks. What if something happens? If we lose? "Don't say that." Marcus's voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "We're not losing anything, you hear me? You and our baby are going to be fine." But even as he said the words, they felt fragile, like he was grasping at them, trying to convince himself they were true. The ambulance rocked gently as it took a sharp corner, the siren wailing through the night. Every second felt like a lifetime, stretched out and heavy with uncertainty. Latasha closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain and fear. She could hear the beeping of the monitors, the faint radio chatter from the paramedics, Marcus's whispered reassurances, but her thoughts kept pulling her back to that moment outside the store. She saw Thompson sneer, heard the cold way he spoke to her, felt the sharp impact of his fist against her belly. the way he had looked at her. Not as a person, not even as a pregnant woman, but as a problem to be handled. Tears slid down her cheeks again, and Marcus wiped them away gently with his thumb. "We're almost there," he whispered. "Just hold on a little longer, okay?" Latasha nodded weakly, grateful for Marcus's strength even as she felt her own slipping away. The ambulance bounced slightly as it pulled into the hospital driveway, the wheels screeching to a halt. The back doors flew open, and the paramedics moved swiftly, rolling Latasha out on the stretcher. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital entrance flooded her vision, and voices blurred together as nurses rushed to meet them. 30-year-old female, 7 months pregnant, one paramedic reported as they wheeled her through the emergency room doors. Blunt trauma to the abdomen, fetal heart rate is low, possible preterm labor. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Preterm labor. He could barely keep up as they rushed Latasha through the hallways, the wheels of the stretcher squeaking against the tiles. "Sir, you need to wait here," a nurse told Marcus firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder as they pushed Latasha through a set of double doors. "I know, I need to be with her," Marcus protested, trying to follow. But the nurse blocked him gently. "We'll take care of her," she assured him. "We need to act quickly, but she's in good hands." Marcus stood frozen for a moment, helplessly watching as the doors swung shut behind Latasha's stretcher. He pressed his hands to his face, trying to keep the panic at bay, trying not to think of what might happen on the other side of those doors. And then it hit him. What if Officer Thompson's actions cost them their child? The thought made his knees feel weak, and he had to grip the edge of the nearest chair to steady himself. As the clock ticked away, Marcus sat in the waiting area, clutching his phone in his hand. The videos from earlier were already making rounds online. Notifications buzzed endlessly, people sharing, commenting, outraged. He stared at the screen, watching as the world began to respond to what Thompson had done. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was what was happening behind those doors. Marcus sat hunched over, praying that Latasha and their baby would survive this. Minutes stretched into eternity as he waited for someone, anyone, to tell him what was happening. And as he sat there, heart heavy with fear, he knew this wasn't just an accident, not just one of those unfortunate incidents they always talked about on the news. This was deliberate, and now the consequences were in motion. Latasha lay on the hospital bed, surrounded by a blur of activity as nurses and doctors worked urgently. The beeping monitors and rapid conversations created a chaotic symphony, but all she could focus on was the relentless ache in her belly and the terrifying uncertainty about her child. "Her blood pressure's spiking," a nurse warned, adjusting the IV running into Latasha's arm. The doctor, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, leaned over Latasha. "We're monitoring your baby closely. It looks like we're on the edge of preterm labor, but we're doing everything we can to stabilize both of you." Latasha nodded weakly, her breathing shallow. Her body trembled with exhaustion, and fear settled into every fiber of her being. "Please," she whispered. "My baby. Is the baby okay?" The doctor gave her a reassuring but serious look. "We've got a faint heartbeat, but we need to monitor it closely. Right now, we're focused on getting your body to calm down so we can avoid an early delivery." Latasha fought to stay conscious, but the pain was wearing her down. Every second without knowing if her baby would make it felt like a lifetime. As she lay there, flashes of the incident played through her mind. The impact of the punch, Thompson's cold expression, and the helplessness she felt lying on the ground while the officer decided her fate. What kind of person strikes a pregnant woman? A nurse adjusted her blankets gently. "You're doing great, Latasha. Just breathe. We'll do an ultrasound soon to get a better look at the baby. Hang in there, okay?" But hanging in there felt like holding on by a thread. Her body felt like it was betraying her, clenching, cramping, as if determined to push her child into the world before it was ready. She closed her eyes and tried to will the pain away, tried to tell herself that everything would be fine. Suddenly, the doors to the room swung open, and Marcus appeared, his face pale with fear, but determined to be by her side. He rushed over to her, grasping her hand, his presence a welcome anchor in the storm. "I'm here, baby," Marcus whispered, kissing her forehead. "I'm here. I told you I wouldn't leave." Latasha exhaled, relief flooding her in spite of the pain. Having him next to her made it feel just a little more bearable. The doctor glanced at Marcus, giving him a brief nod. "We're stabilizing her, but we're not out of the woods yet. She's showing signs of preterm labor and the baby's heart rate is still weak." Marcus swallowed hard. But the baby's going to make it, right?" "We're doing everything we can," the doctor replied. The vagueness in her voice hit Marcus like a blow. Latasha's grip on his hand tightened. She could feel Marcus shaking, could see how much effort it took for him to hold himself together. "I'm scared, Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," he whispered back, his own voice cracking. "But I've got you. No matter what happens, I've got you and our baby." They sat like that for a moment, two souls clinging to each other in the face of uncertainty, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a vice. A nurse reappeared, rolling in the ultrasound machine. "We're going to take a look at the baby now," she said gently, squirting gel onto Latasha's stomach. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Marcus held his breath as the ultrasound wand moved over Latasha's belly, the screen flickering with black and white images. The doctor studied the screen carefully, her brow furrowed. Seconds passed, each one heavier than the last. Then finally a soft, rhythmic thumping echoed through the room, the baby's heartbeat, weak but present. "There it is," the doctor said, offering a small, relieved smile. "It's faint, but it's there. That's a good sign." Marcus exhaled loudly, tears slipping from the corners of his eyes. He pressed his forehead against Latasha's, overwhelmed with emotion. "We've got this, baby. Our little fighter is hanging in there." Latasha let out a shaky breath, tears of relief mixing with the fear that still lingered. Her baby was alive, for now, and that was all she needed to hold on to. The doctor straightened up, wiping the gel from Latasha's belly. "We're going to admit you for observation, just to make sure everything stays stable. If we can get through the next 24 hours without complications, your baby should be safe." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "We're not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, we'll get through this." Latasha gave his hand a weak squeeze, grateful for his unwavering presence. But even as relief began to settle over her, a dark thought tugged at the back of her mind. Officer Thompson was still out there, and his actions had nearly taken everything from her. And she knew this fight wasn't over, not even close. Morning light filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting soft beams across the sterile walls. Latasha lay propped up against the bed's pillows, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand, his eyes red from a night without sleep. A knock at the door pulled their attention. Two nurses entered quietly, checking Latasha's vitals and jotting down notes. "Everything's holding steady," one of them said softly. "You'll need to stay for observation, but so far, your baby seems to be doing okay." Marcus exhaled deeply, rubbing his face in relief. Latasha smiled faintly, grateful for the positive news, though the trauma of the previous night still clung to her like a shadow. As the nurses left, Marcus's phone buzzed on the small table beside him. He reached for it reluctantly, already knowing what he would find. Notifications flooded the screen, message after message from friends, family, and even strangers, some offering support, others demanding answers. One text stood out. It was from Marcus's cousin. "The videos everywhere. People are furious. You need to see this." Marcus opened the link and stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as the familiar scene unfolded. The shaky footage showed Officer Thompson delivering the punch, Latasha crumpling to the ground, clutching her belly, and Marcus rushing to her side. The voices of bystanders could be heard in the background, filled with disbelief and outrage. "You hit a pregnant woman, man. What the hell is wrong with you?" One voice shouted, and then another. "This is going online. You're done." The clip ended with Officer Thompson calling for backup, his voice cold and indifferent, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a routine stop. Marcus clenched his fists, rage bubbling beneath the surface. "The whole world's gonna see what he did," he muttered. "He's not walking away from this. Not this time." Latasha rested a hand on Marcus's arm, sensing the anger building in him. "Marcus," she said softly, "we need to focus on the baby right now." "I know," Marcus whispered, squeezing her hand in return. "But they're not sweeping this under the rug. Not this time." Outside the hospital, things were moving quickly. The video of the assault had spread across social media like wildfire. Local news stations had picked it up overnight, and now larger media outlets were starting to run the story. Protests were already being planned. People in the community were outraged, calling for Officer Thompson's immediate suspension. The hashtag #Justice for Latasha began trending, and posts demanding accountability flooded every platform. Within hours, the police department was under pressure from every angle. The chief of police, Nathan Hughes, sat at his desk with a grim expression, staring at the same video that everyone else had seen. His phone buzzed with calls from reporters and city officials demanding a statement, but the weight of the situation hung heavy in the room. Hughes knew the department had faced backlash before, but this was different. The sight of a visibly pregnant woman being assaulted by one of his officers was damning in a way no statement or press conference could easily dismiss. He dialed Officer Thompson's number, his jaw tight with frustration. Thompson picked up after the second ring, his voice casual, as if nothing had happened. "Chief," he said. "Thompson," Hughes barked. "I need you in my office, now." Back in the hospital room, Latasha scrolled through her phone with Marcus, both of them overwhelmed by the flood of messages. Some were from old friends, expressing shock and support. Others were from strangers, people who had seen the video and wanted to offer their solidarity. But mixed in with the messages of encouragement were the darker ones, anonymous comments defending Thompson, accusing Latasha of provoking the situation, questioning what she had done to deserve the treatment. Latasha sighed, her heart heavy. "Why do they always find a way to blame us?" she whispered. Marcus's eyes darkened. "Because they want to protect him. They always do." But before Latasha could respond, the door opened and a hospital administrator stepped inside, accompanied by a police officer in plain clothes. "Mr. and Mrs. James," the administrator began cautiously, "we need to speak with you about last night's incident." Marcus stood, his body tense. If this is some excuse to defend Thompson. The officer raised a hand. "I'm here to inform you that Officer Thompson has been placed on leave, effective immediately. An investigation is already underway." Marcus narrowed his eyes, skeptical. "On leave? That's it? He should be in jail." "I understand your frustration," the officer replied, shifting awkwardly. "But we need to follow procedure. The chief will release a statement soon." Latasha watched Marcus closely, knowing that his anger could easily boil over. She placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to hold on for now. Marcus inhaled sharply, his fists still clenched, but he gave a small nod. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. The officer gave them both a curt nod before turning to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, Marcus sat back down, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "They're going to try and stall," Marcus said bitterly, scrolling through more of the online posts. "Delay it, hope people forget, but we're not letting this go." Latasha gave his hand a squeeze. "We won't," she whispered. "No matter how long it takes, we're going to fight this." Marcus met her gaze, seeing the same fire in her eyes that burned in his own. This was only the beginning. They weren't just victims of what happened. They were going to make sure something changed. As noon approached, the hospital room filled with an uneasy stillness. Latasha and Marcus sat close together on the small bed, scrolling through endless streams of posts, comments, and news coverage. Every major news network was now running the story, flashing the disturbing footage on repeat. The video had grown beyond their town, becoming a nationwide outrage, triggering waves of conversations about police violence, racism, and the abuse of power. Marcus tossed his phone onto the bedside table, frustration etched on his face. "They're talking about it like it's just another incident," he muttered. "Like it's not a pregnant woman he hit. Like it's not you." Latasha placed a hand on his leg, grounding him. "People are paying attention now," she whispered. "That's what matters." But even she couldn't fully convince herself of those words. How many times had they seen this happen? How many people had rallied behind a cause, only for it to fade into the background when the media moved on to the next tragedy? A soft knock interrupted their thoughts, and the door creaked open to reveal Marcus's cousin, Andre, phone in hand. "Yo, you need to see this," Andre said, stepping into the room and holding out his screen. Marcus grabbed the phone, eyebrows furrowed. The live-streamed press conference from Police Chief Nathan Hughes was already in progress. They leaned in to listen as the chief stood behind a podium, flanked by officers in solemn blue uniforms, the flashing cameras reflecting off their badges. Chief Hughes cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone. His tone was measured, carefully rehearsed, the kind of speech designed to say just enough without saying too much. "First and foremost, I want to extend my concern to Ms. Latasha James and her family. We are aware of the troubling incident that took place last night, and I want to assure the public that an internal investigation is already underway." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, his frustration boiling over. "Concern? That's what they're calling it?" Andre shook his head. "Keep watching," he said grimly. The chief continued, carefully avoiding the word assault as he spoke. "Effective immediately, Officer Thompson has been placed on administrative leave. We understand the public's concerns and take this matter very seriously. We are committed to transparency and accountability throughout this investigation." Marcus clenched his fists. "Administrative leave? That's not accountability," he growled. "He should be in jail, not sitting at home waiting for this to blow over." Latasha placed a calming hand on his shoulder, though her heart mirrored his anger. They both knew the script. The same tired promises of investigations, transparency, and accountability, delivered to pacify the public. "And to those of you who have expressed frustration and anger," the chief continued, glancing briefly at the cameras, "I ask for patience. These processes take time, but I assure you that we will get to the truth of what happened." Marcus scoffed. "Yeah, right. They're just waiting for the noise to die down." The reporters wasted no time. As soon as the chief stopped speaking, questions flew at him from every direction. "Why wasn't Officer Thompson arrested on the spot?" one reporter asked sharply. Chief Hughes hesitated, visibly uncomfortable under the spotlight. "As with any investigation, we need to follow protocol and gather all the facts before making any final determinations." Marcus felt a bitter laugh escape him. Translation, they're giving him cover. Andre glanced between Marcus and Latasha, his expression grim. "This is all for show," he muttered. "They don't care about the truth. They just want to control the narrative before it spins out of their hands." Latasha took a deep breath, trying to temper the rising tide of emotions in the room. They couldn't afford to let anger cloud their focus. This wasn't just about one night anymore. It was about making sure Thompson and others like him were held accountable. Really accountable, not just shuffled out of sight until the outrage died down. Across town, outside the police station, protesters were already gathering, holding signs that read, "Justice for Latasha," "End police brutality," and "No justice, no peace." What started as a handful of community members had grown into a crowd of hundreds. Bystanders joined in, inspired by the video and angered by the chief's vague response. "Justice for Latasha," they chanted, voices growing louder with each repetition. The crowd surged with energy, united by their demand for real change. Several local activists took the microphone, addressing the protesters through bullhorns. "We've heard this story too many times," one speaker shouted, their voice filled with fury. "How many more mothers, daughters, and sisters will it take before they stop killing us in the streets? How many more lives will they destroy before we see real accountability?" The crowd roared in agreement. It wasn't just about Latasha anymore. It was about all the lives that had been harmed by unchecked power and prejudice. Meanwhile, social media was ablaze. Every major platform was flooded with the video and angry posts demanding justice. Activists, celebrities, and community leaders amplified the story, sharing messages of support and solidarity. The hashtag #Justice for Latasha trended nationally, putting more pressure on the police department to act swiftly. Back in the hospital, Marcus paced near the window, tension radiating from every step. "It's not enough," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They'll stall, and then they'll try to sweep this under the rug like they always do." Latasha watched him, her heart heavy. She knew he was right, but she also knew that anger alone wouldn't win this fight. It had to be deliberate, calculated. They needed to stay one step ahead of the system, designed to protect people like Thompson. "We need to get a lawyer," Latasha said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Marcus stopped pacing, turning to look at her. Yeah, you're right," he said, the wheels in his mind already turning. "We're not waiting for them to decide if this matters. We're going to make sure it does." Latasha gave him a small, tired nod. "This has to be bigger than us," she whispered. "If we let this slide, it'll happen to someone else." Marcus sat beside her on the bed and took her hand in his. "It won't slide," he promised. "Not this time. We'll make sure of it." As they sat together in the quiet hospital room, they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they also knew that the world was watching now, and they weren't going to let this moment pass without a fight. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for every person who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. And this time, they wouldn't stop until real justice was served. The hospital room was quieter now, save for the hum of the machines monitoring Latasha's vitals. Outside the door, nurses bustled about. But inside, Marcus and Latasha sat in silence, their hands intertwined, each lost in thought. They both knew the fight ahead would be a long one, and they would need more than just public outrage to see it through. A soft knock broke the silence. Marcus turned to see Andre slipping back into the room, followed by a woman in a sharp gray suit. Her presence carried authority, and her expression was one of quiet determination. "This is Mia Jacobs," Andre introduced. "She's one of the best civil rights lawyers around. I told her everything, and she said she'd take your case." Mia stepped forward, giving Latasha a warm, respectful nod. "Mrs. James, I'm so sorry for what you've been through. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight. We're going to hold them accountable." Marcus stood up, extending his hand. "We appreciate you coming," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Mia shook his hand firmly. "I've reviewed the footage and spoken with some witnesses," she said, getting straight to business. "We have a strong case, but it's going to be an uphill battle. The department's going to fight hard to protect Thompson and themselves." Latasha shifted in bed, grimacing slightly from the discomfort. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Mia pulled out a notepad from her leather bag. "First, we'll need to file an official complaint with the department to start the process. They'll try to drag their feet, but we'll make sure they know this isn't going away. Next, we'll file a civil suit, not just against Officer Thompson, but the entire department for enabling this kind of behavior." Marcus's jaw tightened. "He's done this before, hasn't he? There's no way this was the first time." Mia gave him a grim nod. "I've already started digging into his record. There are complaints, lots of them, but none ever stuck. Suspensions, warnings, all swept under the rug." Latasha's heart sank. How many others had suffered because the system protected Thompson? How many complaints had gone ignored? Mia leaned in, her tone measured but resolute. "That's where public pressure comes in. The video going viral gives us leverage. The department will be scrambling to save face, and that's where we strike. We demand immediate disciplinary action, not just administrative leave. We push for criminal charges, too." Marcus sat down again, rubbing his hands over his face. And if they try to block us? What then? Mia's expression sharpened. Then we go louder. We'll have activists, the media, and community leaders backing us. They can't ignore us if the whole world is watching. We'll turn every delay into another headline, every stonewall into more fuel for the movement. Latasha glanced at Marcus, seeing the flicker of hope in his eyes for the first time since the incident. We fight, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. We make sure they can't do this again. Later that evening, Mia left the hospital, promising to return the next morning with the necessary paperwork to get things moving. As Marcus sat back down beside Latasha, exhaustion settling into his bones, the weight of everything felt just a little lighter. For the first time, they had a plan. But just as Marcus closed his eyes, his phone buzzed again. Another notification, a breaking news alert. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the screen. His eyes narrowed as he read the headline. Police Union defends Officer Thompson. Calls incident. A misunderstanding. Marcus's blood boiled as he read the statement from the Union president, dismissing the assault as an overreaction to a hostile encounter. This officer was just doing his job, the statement read. He acted in good faith, believing the situation required swift action. It's unfortunate what happened, but we stand by him. Marcus slammed the phone down on the table, rage simmering just below the surface. It was happening exactly the way they feared. The system was closing ranks around Thompson, circling the wagons to protect him from accountability. They're not even trying to hide it, Marcus muttered bitterly. They're already covering for him. Latasha watched him carefully, her own anger bubbling beneath the surface, though exhaustion dulled its edge. That's why we have to stay focused, she whispered. They want us to lose control, to make us the bad guys in this story. We can't let them. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. But it feels like they always win. No matter what, they find a way to come out clean. Latasha reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Not this time, she said firmly. This time we have the truth on our side. And this time, we have the world watching. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw still tight, but he knew she was right. They had to stay sharp, keep moving forward, no matter how many obstacles were thrown their way. Because this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about every person who had ever been silenced, every family broken by violence and injustice. And they weren't going to stop until justice was more than just a word. They were going to make it real, for their child, for their community, and for everyone who deserved better. And this time, nothing would stop them. The following morning, the sound of buzzing phones and notifications filled the hospital room. Latasha's story had become national news. News anchors debated the incident on morning talk shows. Activists flooded social media with calls for justice, and protests outside the police station swelled in numbers. What had started as a community outcry had evolved into a national movement. Marcus scrolled through Twitter, seeing thousands of posts with the hashtag #sign Justice for Latasha. People were sharing similar stories, recounting their own experiences of police violence and injustice, amplifying the message far beyond their small town. Look at this, Marcus said, showing his phone to Latasha. They're organizing protests in 5 other cities. People are marching for us, for you. Latasha gave a tired but grateful smile, though the weight of it all still pressed down on her. The support was overwhelming, but it was also a reminder that the fight wasn't just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had been wronged by the system. A knock on the door broke the moment. Andre entered, holding a stack of flyers and posters for the upcoming rally. He had been working with local organizers all night to get everything in place. We've got the rally set for tomorrow, Andre said, setting the flyers on the table. It's going to be big. Word spreading fast. Community leaders, local activists, even a couple of journalists from out of state are coming. Marcus picked up one of the flyers, reading the bold words printed across the top. Justice for Latasha, demand action now. Below it, the date, time, and location of the rally were listed, along with a call for peaceful but determined protest. They're not going to ignore us, Andre said firmly. Not with this kind of pressure. Marcus nodded, though a flicker of doubt still lingered in his mind. They'll try, though. They always do, he muttered. We won't let them, Andre shot back. We keep showing up. Every time they try to sweep it under the rug, we push harder. We make sure they know we're not backing down. Latasha shifted slightly, grimacing as the ache in her belly reminded her of the trauma still fresh in her body. The emotional and physical toll was beginning to catch up with her, but she knew there was no time to rest. Not yet. I'll be there, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fatigue. I want them to see me. I want them to know that I'm still here, and I'm not going away. Marcus turned to her, concern flashing in his eyes. Are you sure? You need rest, baby. We can handle this. You don't have to do it all yourself. Latasha shook her head. This is my fight too, she said firmly. They need to see my face, see what they tried to take from me. If we let them treat this like just another news cycle, they'll move on and forget. Marcus knew she was right. Her presence at the rally would be powerful, a reminder of the violence and injustice she had endured. It would make it harder for them to dismiss her, harder to spin the story in their favor. Okay, Marcus said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But if you get tired, you let me know. We'll leave whenever you need to. Latasha nodded, grateful for his support. I just need them to see me, she whispered. They need to know that I survived and that I'm not stopping until we get justice. Outside the hospital, the city was already buzzing with anticipation. News vans lined the streets near the police station, reporters waiting to cover the protests and the rally. Activists passed out signs and T-shirts to volunteers, while speakers and organizers made final preparations. Back inside, Marcus's phone buzzed with a new message. This time from Mia Jacobs, their lawyer. Just got word, the message read. Chief Hughes is planning a second press conference. He's feeling the pressure. Looks like they might announce more disciplinary action against Thompson. But don't let up. They're hoping to pacify people with small gestures. We need to keep the momentum going. Marcus read the message aloud, and Latasha gave a knowing nod. They knew this game all too well. The department would offer just enough to make it seem like they were doing something, hoping the public would lose interest and move on. Not this time, Marcus muttered under his breath, clenching his fists. Andre grinned. That's right. They've already lost control of the narrative, and we're not giving it back. Latasha looked out the window, seeing the growing movement unfold on the streets below. Her heart swelled with a mixture of hope and determination. For the first time since the assault, she felt something other than fear. She felt power. We fight, she whispered as if speaking it into existence. We fight until they have no choice but to change. Marcus sat beside her, squeezing her hand. And we don't stop until it's real, not just promises. Real change. Latasha leaned into him, feeling the strength in his words, and knowing that together they could weather whatever storm lay ahead. Because this fight wasn't just about one night. It was about every person who had ever been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. And now, their voices would be heard. The next morning, the streets outside the police station were alive with energy. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Latasha," "End police violence," and "Stop racist cops." The crowd buzzed with righteous anger, voices blending together in chants that echoed down the streets. No justice, no peace. Say her name, Latasha James. Marcus stood beside Latasha, who was seated in a wheelchair at the front of the rally. She refused to stay home, insisting that her presence would send a message louder than any statement or press release. She wore a T-shirt with the words, "Still Here," printed boldly across the front, a quiet but powerful declaration that she had survived and wasn't backing down. Andre was on the megaphone, hyping the crowd, his voice filled with conviction. They think they can wait us out, he shouted. They think if they drag their feet long enough, we'll stop showing up. But we're not going anywhere, are we? No! The crowd roared back, fists raised in unison. Marcus leaned down toward Latasha, brushing a soft kiss on her temple. You doing okay, baby? He asked, Concern etched into his face despite the fire burning in his heart. "I'm good," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I need to be here." At the center of the rally, local activists took turns speaking. Some shared their own stories of injustice. Others spoke of change and accountability. Community leaders, clergy members, and parents stood together, united in their demand for action. One speaker, an older woman with graying hair and tears in her eyes, addressed the crowd with quiet strength. "I've been marching for justice since the 60s, she said. "And I'm tired. Tired of seeing our children suffer. Tired of saying the same things over and over only to be met with excuses. But today, I feel hope. Because look at us. We are still here. And we won't stop until they hear us." The crowd cheered, a collective energy surging through the streets. This wasn't just a protest. It was a movement. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Chief Hughes watched the rally unfold through the window of his office. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable as the chants from outside filtered through the glass. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear the public wasn't going to back down. He glanced at the statement prepared on his desk, the same carefully worded nonsense that had been used 100 times before. Apologies, promises of investigations, calls for patience. It wasn't enough this time, and he knew it. The people outside wanted real action, and nothing less would satisfy them. His phone buzzed on the desk, another message from the mayor, urging him to resolve the situation quickly before it spiraled further out of control. Hughes rubbed his temples, knowing that the department's usual tactics wouldn't work this time. He reached for the phone and dialed Officer Thompson's number. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. Thompson knew what was coming. Back at the rally, Mia Jacobs took the stage, her sharp voice cutting through the crowd's noise. "We're not asking for change anymore," Mia declared, her voice strong and clear. "We're demanding it. No more excuses, no more investigations that go nowhere, and no more officers protected by broken systems. We demand accountability, and we demand it now." The crowd erupted in cheers, the energy shifting from frustration to determination. They were no longer pleading for change. They were taking it. "And we won't stop," Mia continued, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "Not until Latasha James gets the justice she deserves, and not until every person who has ever been treated like she was gets the justice they were denied." Latasha felt tears well in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. Hope that this time, things could be different. Marcus knelt beside her, his hand resting on her knee, his expression filled with pride and love. "This is only the beginning," he whispered. Latasha nodded, feeling the strength of the people around her. The fight was far from over, but they weren't fighting alone. For the first time in a long time, she felt powerful, not because of what she had survived, but because she knew she was part of something bigger than herself. The rally continued, with speakers, chants, and songs filling the air. Reporters moved through the crowd, capturing footage for the evening news, while social media exploded with live streams and photos. And then, as the sun began to set, the news they had been waiting for finally arrived. Marcus's phone buzzed with an alert, a breaking news notification. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening. "Baby," he whispered, turning the phone toward Latasha. "They're charging him. Thompson's being arrested." Latasha stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It was official. Officer Thompson had been charged with assault, misconduct, and endangering the life of a pregnant woman. The crowd around them erupted in cheers as word spread, the energy surging like a wave. People hugged, cried, and raised their fists in triumph. The first step toward justice had been taken. Marcus knelt beside Latasha, his hand cradling her face as tears streamed down both of their cheeks. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Latasha nodded, overwhelmed by the moment. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a victory. And in that moment, surrounded by people chanting her name, she knew that they had already made a difference. As the rally began to wind down, Latasha and Marcus sat quietly, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. They had fought, and they had won the first battle. But they knew there was more to come. The road to justice was long, and they would need to keep pushing, keep fighting, until real change took hold. For now, though, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe, a moment to rest in the knowledge that they were no longer victims of what had happened. They were survivors, warriors, and advocates for change. And no matter what came next, they would keep going, for themselves, for their child, and for every person who needed them to keep fighting. Because this wasn't just about one moment, one incident, or one cop. It was about building a better world, and they weren't going to stop until that world became a reality. "We're still here," Latasha whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Marcus squeezed her hand. "And we're not going anywhere." The victory at the rally brought a sense of hope, but Latasha and Marcus knew the fight was far from over. Officer Thompson's arrest was only the beginning of what would be a long and grueling legal battle. They weren't just seeking justice for Latasha. They were fighting to change a system that had protected men like Thompson for far too long. A week later, Latasha and Marcus sat in their lawyer Mia Jacobs' office, reviewing the next steps. Stacks of legal documents and news clippings covered the desk, a testament to how much attention the case had garnered. Mia leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning over a document. "The charges are solid, but the department's lawyers will do everything they can to minimize Thompson's punishment," she explained. "They'll push for a plea deal to avoid public scrutiny. We need to decide how far we're willing to go." Marcus shook his head, the frustration still raw. "He doesn't get to walk away with a slap on the wrist, not after what he did." Mia nodded. "I agree, but we need to be strategic. If this case goes to trial, it will be brutal. They'll try to paint Latasha as the aggressor. They'll dig into your past, your finances, anything they can find to discredit you." Latasha exhaled slowly. She knew this would happen. It always did. They would try to turn her into the villain in her own story, casting doubt on her actions to protect Thompson and the department. "Whatever they dig up, we're ready," Marcus said firmly, gripping Latasha's hand. "We're not backing down." Mia smiled, appreciating their determination. "Good," she said. "We'll fight this together, and we'll fight it in court and in the public arena. Every delay, every excuse they make, we'll bring it to light. We'll make sure the world sees exactly what they're trying to hide." Over the following weeks, the legal battle began to unfold. Thompson's defense team argued that the incident was a misunderstanding, that he had acted within protocol and felt threatened by Latasha's non-compliance. They tried to frame Marcus as an angry husband, suggesting that his involvement escalated the situation. But the video evidence told a different story. Every time they tried to spin the narrative, the footage of Thompson striking Latasha reappeared online, shared and reshared by activists, journalists, and supporters from across the country. News anchors discussed the case nightly, and protests continued in the streets, each one larger than the last. The community refused to let the case be buried. The rally had sparked something bigger, a collective movement demanding justice not just for Latasha but for every victim of police brutality. Inside their home, Latasha and Marcus adjusted to a new normal. Latasha's pregnancy continued with frequent hospital checkups to ensure the baby's health. Each appointment was a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But the doctors remained optimistic, and with every passing day, their baby grew stronger. A small victory in a sea of uncertainty. "We're gonna get through this," Marcus would whisper to Latasha every night, rubbing her belly gently. "All three of us." Thompson's trial was set to begin in 6 weeks, and the tension grew with each passing day. The police department had announced additional reforms in an attempt to placate the public, but no one was fooled. The department was in damage control mode, trying to salvage its reputation in the wake of the growing scandal. At night, Marcus and Latasha would scroll through their phones, reading messages of support from people across the world. Strangers shared their own stories of injustice, finding strength in the Jameses' fight for justice. The outpouring of solidarity was overwhelming, reminding them that they weren't alone. One evening, as Latasha sat on the couch, Marcus brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked softly. Latasha nodded, resting her hand on her belly. "Just tired," she admitted, "but I feel hopeful." Marcus gave her a small smile. "Me too," he said. "We're not just fighting for us, you know. We're fighting for everyone, and this time we're not losing." Latasha leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the strength of his words. They both knew the road ahead was long, but for the first time, they felt like they were on the right path. As the trial date approached, the police department tried one last time to negotiate a plea deal, an offer designed to avoid public backlash and save their reputation. But Latasha and Marcus refused. "We're going to trial," Latasha told Mia. "People need to see this play out. They need to see what he did, and they need to see what justice looks like." Mia gave her a proud nod. "Then we'll see it through," she said, "all the way." And with that, the stage was set. The trial would begin soon, and the eyes of the nation would be watching. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the first day of Officer Thompson's trial. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras trained on the entrance, ready to capture every moment. The world was watching, and Latasha could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She sat in the front row with Marcus at her side, their lawyer Mia Jacobs beside them, her posture calm and confident. This was the moment they had fought for. After weeks of protests, media pressure, and endless legal maneuvering, the truth would finally be heard. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. Thompson sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team, his expression carefully neutral. He avoided eye contact with Latasha, as though she didn't exist. The prosecution began by laying out the facts, the video footage, witness testimonies, and the history of complaints against Thompson. They painted a picture of a man who had abused his authority time and time again, protected by a system that refused to hold him accountable. Until now. When it was Mia's turn, she stood and faced the jury, her voice steady and clear. "What you will see in this trial is not just an isolated act of violence. It is the result of a system that has allowed officers like Rick Thompson to believe they are above accountability. This time, however, that system will not protect him." She turned slightly, meeting Latasha's gaze for a moment before continuing. "This is about more than one punch. This is about every person who has ever been treated as though their life didn't matter, and it ends here." The trial dragged on for days, each session emotionally exhausting for Latasha and Marcus. Thompson's defense team tried to discredit her, framing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, arguing that Thompson acted out of fear for his safety. But the evidence was undeniable. Every time the defense tried to twist the narrative, the video of Thompson's punch was played again, haunting, undeniable proof of his guilt. Witnesses testified, recounting what they had seen that night: a pregnant woman struck by a man in uniform, and a community that rose in outrage. Latasha sat quietly through it all, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the occasional flutter from her baby, a reminder of why she had endured all of this. This wasn't just about justice for her, it was about building a safer world for her child. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was palpable. Latasha gripped Marcus's hand tightly, her heart pounding as the jury returned with their decision. The judge read the verdict slowly, deliberately. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Rick Thompson, guilty of assault, misconduct, and endangering the life of a pregnant woman." A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief and satisfaction. Latasha exhaled, the breath she had been holding finally released. Marcus squeezed her hand, his eyes brimming with tears of relief and pride. They had done it. Justice had been served. Thompson sat motionless, his face pale as the reality of the verdict set in. For the first time, he would face consequences for his actions, something he had believed would never happen. After the trial, The crowd gathered outside the courthouse, reporters swarming around Latasha and Marcus as they emerged, victorious but exhausted. Mia stood with them, fielding questions from journalists, her words crisp and unwavering. "This verdict is not just a victory for Latasha James," Mia told the reporters. "It is a victory for every person who has ever been failed by a broken system. And it is a reminder that when we stand together, we can demand and achieve accountability." Latasha looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces from the protests, friends, family, and strangers who had become allies along the way. For the first time since the night of the assault, she felt truly free. That night, Latasha and Marcus sat quietly at home, the weight of the ordeal finally beginning to lift. The trial was over, Thompson was behind bars, and they could finally look toward the future. Their baby was safe, and so were they. Marcus leaned over, resting his hand on Latasha's belly. "We did it," he whispered, his voice full of awe and relief. Latasha smiled, placing her hand over his. "We did," she whispered back, "and we're going to keep going." Marcus nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. They had fought for justice and won, but there was still more to do, more change to fight for, more battles to win, and they would fight them, together. Months later, their baby was born, a healthy baby girl full of life and promise. They named her Hope, a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, and everything they had overcome. As Marcus held their daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his face, he knew that Hope's future would be different, because they had fought to make it so. Latasha watched them together, her heart full. This was their new beginning, a life free from fear, a future built on justice and love. And as she cradled her baby in her arms, Latasha knew one thing for certain: they would never stop fighting for a better world, not for themselves, not for their daughter, not for anyone. They had survived the storm, and now they would spend the rest of their lives making sure no one else had to weather one alone. Because they were still here, and they weren't going anywhere. Like the story? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Stay tuned for the next video. You won't want to miss it.